Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to those early shores of what they call the New World, back when America was still mostly mud, mosquitoes, and misplaced optimism. Settle in under the covers, dim the lights if you haven't already, maybe keep just the bedside lamp on low. We're going to spend some slow, gentle hours wandering through the everyday texture of colonial life. Not the polished founding father statues or the Thanksgiving postcards. No, this is the quieter, grittier version. The blisters from wooden plows, the smoke that never quite left your clothes, the nights when dinner was whatever didn't die first. Let the words roll out soft and steady, like the slow current of the James River on a still morning, before it inevitably turns a little brackish. Breathe easy now. We got time. Let's begin at the beginning, with Jamestown in 1607. The Virginia Company sent over about 100 men and boys, mostly gentlemen, who thought digging for gold was beneath them, but apparently starving wasn't. They arrived in late spring, chose a swampy peninsula because it looked defensible, and immediately started dying. Malaria, dysentery, typhoid, what the settlers called the seasoning, took most of them within months. By the end of the first winter, only 38 were left standing. They built a triangular fort of rough-hewn logs and packed earth, with watchtowers at each corner and a church in the middle that doubled as a meeting hall. Inside the palisade, the first shelters were nothing more than lean-tos or holes dug into the ground with canvas stretched over the top. No one had planned for Virginia's humidity. The thatch roofs rotted. The dirt floors turned to mud with every rain. A typical early dwelling, if you can call it that, was maybe 16 by 20 feet, one room, a packed dirt floor that never dried completely. The hearth was simply a hole in the ground with stones around it. Smoke escaped through a hole in the roof, or just hung in the air until your eyes watered. Beds were pallets of straw or corn husks laid on the floor, shared by however many people squeezed in. Fleas and lice were constant companions. People scratched in their sleep and pretended it was normal. Windows? At first, none, just shutters or oiled paper that lent a sickly yellow light. The gentlemen complained bitterly about the conditions, but digging wells and planting crops seemed too much like manual labor. John Smith, ever the self-promoter, later wrote that he had to threaten to hang anyone who wouldn't work. Naturally, the moment he left, things got worse again. Food was the real daily drama. The first years were famine punctuated by occasional feasts. They traded with the Powhatan for corn, but relations soured fast. Raids, ambushes, burned fields. When supplies ran out, people ate anything. Acorns boiled into mush, dogs, horses, even leather boiled soft enough to chew. The starving time of 1609 to 1610 saw settlers digging up corpses for food. Cannibalism was documented, though quietly. Breakfast, when there was any, might be a handful of parched corn or a thin gruel of boiled roots. Lunch was whatever could be foraged: oysters from the river, fish if the nets held, wild greens if no one had poisoned themselves trying them. Dinner repeated the pattern, perhaps with a bit of salted pork if a supply ship had arrived. Water was brackish. Beer was safer because the boiling killed germs, so even children drank small beer. Scurvy turned gums black and teeth loose. People spat blood into the dirt and kept going. Tobacco changed everything, of course. John Rolfe, husband of Pocahontas, because history loves neat stories, experimented with sweeter West Indian strains around 1612. Suddenly the swampy peninsula had a cash crop. Planters shifted from starvation to obsession. Fields everywhere, food crops neglected again. Servants and later enslaved Africans did the backbreaking work, clearing land, planting, topping plants, curing leaves in barns that smelled like sweet rot. The wealthy began importing bricks and glass. Their houses grew 2 stories with chimneys at each end. But the ordinary folk, still in one-room cabins, still eating hominy and salt pork, still watching their children die of summer complaint or flux. Let's drift up to Plymouth, 1620. The Pilgrims, about half religious separatists, half economic opportunists, landed in November on a cold, rocky coast far north of their intended destination. The Mayflower stayed anchored while they built. Half died that first winter, pneumonia, scurvy, general misery. They lived aboard ship until spring, then moved ashore to crude shelters. Small timber frames covered with thatch or bark, dirt floors, a central fire pit that smoked constantly. The common house burned down within months. Naturally, they rebuilt it. Houses were tiny, often 12 by 16 feet, with one room downstairs and a loft for sleeping. Windows were small and shuttered. Glass was a luxury, even decades later. Beds were rope-slung frames with straw ticks. Blankets were wool or patch quilts brought from England. Daily life turned on the seasons. Spring meant planting Indian corn in hills with fish buried underneath as fertilizer, a trick learned from Squanto. Summer brought weeding, hoeing, guarding against birds and deer. Fall was harvest. Corn shocked in the fields, pumpkins stored in cellars, apples pressed into cider. Winter was survival, chopping wood, mending tools, spinning wool by the hearth. Women baked bread in outdoor brick ovens when they could afford them, churned butter, made soap from wood ashes and grease. Children gathered kindling, minded younger siblings, learned to card wool or whittle pegs. Sundays were long. Morning service, afternoon catechism, evening psalm singing. No work, no play. Even cooking was minimal. The Puritans who came later to Massachusetts Bay were more organized, but no less austere. Towns were laid out around a meeting house and burying ground. Houses improved slightly, clapboard siding, stone chimneys, but still small and drafty. A prosperous farmer might have 2 rooms downstairs, one for cooking and living, one for sleeping, plus a lean-to kitchen. Furniture was basic: trestle tables, ladder-back chairs, chests for storage. No upholstered sofas. Comfort was suspect. Food was plainer than in England: brown bread, rye and corn, beans, salt cod, pork when they could slaughter. Pumpkins appeared in everything: stewed, baked, dried. Maple syrup sweetened porridge when honey was scarce. Health remained fragile. Midwives delivered most babies at home. Doctors were rare and often untrained. Smallpox, measles, diphtheria swept through like scythes. Inoculation, variolation, was controversial but practiced by some after Cotton Mather championed it during the 1721 Boston epidemic. Herbal remedies ruled: yarrow for fevers, boneset for colds, lobelia for whooping cough. Bleeding and purging were common. Many patients died faster from the cure than the disease. Social life was church-centered. Sermons could last 3 hours. People took notes to discuss later. Court days brought neighbors together. Disputes over stray cows, broken fences, slander. Punishments were public: whipping for fornication, stocks for drunkenness, ducking stool for scolds. In 1692 Salem, the witch panic boiled over from petty grudges and adolescent fits into 19 hangings and 1 pressing. The magistrates, educated, pious men, presided over spectral evidence and spectral torment. Ironic how quickly fear turned neighbors into executioners. Let's linger here a moment, in the glow of a single tallow candle, listening to the wind move through clapboard cracks. Colonial life was not heroic. It was stubborn, repetitive, cold in winter and sticky in summer. The elites built legacies. Most people just try to make it a spring. We'll keep drifting. There's more to see. Now, as the candle in that little colonial room gutters low and the wind finds its way through the cracks again, let's keep drifting forward with the same slow current. We left off in the flicker of those early hearths, Jamestown's mud floors, Plymouth's drafty clapboards, the stubborn repetition of survival. Let's pick up right there, in the gray light before dawn, and follow an ordinary day as it unfolds across the colonies. Not one dramatic sunrise moment, just the long, unbroken stretch of hours that made up most lives. The kind of day that repeated itself 6 days a week, with Sunday offering only a different flavor of stillness. Breathe with it. Let the pace stay even, unhurried. In a Chesapeake tobacco plantation around 1720, the day begins well before first light. A field hand, perhaps an indentured servant from England or an enslaved man from West Africa, wakes on a corn-shuck mattress in a windowless cabin shared with 8 or 10 others. The floor is dirt, swept yesterday, but already dusted again. No pillow, a rolled-up coat or sack serves. Someone coughs wetly in the dark. Malaria lingers in the lowlands like an unwelcome guest who never quite leaves. The air smells of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and the faint sweet rot of curing tobacco leaves stacked in the barn nearby. The overseer's horn sounds before the sky pinks. Everyone rises, pulls on rough Osnaburg shirts and breeches for men, or shifts in petticoats for women, ties kerchiefs or caps against the sun that will soon burn. Breakfast is quick, cold hominy left from supper, perhaps a scrap of bacon rind or a spoonful of molasses if the master is feeling generous. No plates, wooden trenchers, or just cupped hands. Children, some as young as 5, eat standing, then trail the adults to the fields. Work begins at first light and ends at dusk, with a short break at noon under whatever shade can be found. Tobacco demands constant attention. In spring, the seedlings are transplanted by hand, one plant at a time, knee-deep in freshly turned soil. Summer means topping the plants, snapping off the flower heads so the leaves grow thicker, suckering, removing side shoots, and worming, hand-picking fat green hornworms that can strip a stalk overnight. Each worm is dropped into a can or crushed underfoot. The smell clings to fingers for days. Fall brings the harvest. Leaves cut with a curved knife, strung on sticks, hung in ventilated barns to cure. The air inside those barns is thick, golden brown, dizzying. Workers move slowly in the heat, sweat stinging eyes, backs aching from bending. Women's days overlap but diverge. While men and older boys handle the heavy field labor, women and girls tend the kitchen garden. Beans, climbing poles, collards, sweet potatoes, herbs for seasoning and medicine. They milk cows or goats if the household keeps any, churn butter in a dasher churn until arms burn, carry water from the spring in wooden pails balanced on yokes across shoulders. Laundry happens once a week in a big iron kettle over an outdoor fire. Lye soap made from ashes and grease, clothes pounded against a washboard or rocks, then spread on bushes to dry and bleach in the sun. Ironing, if there is an iron, is done with a flat piece of metal heated in the coals. Many families simply smooth garments by hand or under a board. Cooking is never-ending. The main meal, dinner, is eaten around midday. A typical pot might hold a thick stew of salted pork or squirrel, hominy, onions, and whatever greens are ready. Cornbread bakes in a skillet over coals or in a Dutch oven buried in embers. Supper is lighter, leftovers, perhaps mush or pone, and eaten by firelight. Lighting is expensive, pine knot torches or rushlights, rushes dipped in tallow, flicker and spit. Most families go to bed when it gets dark. In New England, the rhythm shifts with the rockier soil and harsher winters. A Massachusetts farm family rises to a house already cold. The banked fire is poked back to life with a bellows. Breakfast is hasty pudding, cornmeal boiled in milk or water, or brown bread steamed in a lidded pot. The husband and sons head to the woodland in winter, felling, splitting, hauling sledges of oak and pine for the insatiable hearth. In spring they plow with oxen, plant rye, barley, Indian corn in the Three Sisters style borrowed from native neighbors. Women and girls spin flax or wool on great wheels that thump rhythmically all day, weave on narrow looms, dye yarn with walnut hulls or madder root. Soap making is a major undertaking once or twice a year. Rendering fat, leaching lye from wood ashes, stirring the caustic mixture in huge kettles outdoors because the fumes sting eyes and throat. Children's chores scale with age. Toddlers carry kindling one stick at a time. 5-year-olds weed gardens, feed chickens, turn the spit over the fire. 10-year-olds milk, churn, card wool, mind younger siblings while mothers work. School, where it existed, was short, perhaps 3 or 4 months in winter when fields lay fallow. Boys learned reading, writing, sums, girls less often, unless the family could spare them. The horn book, a wooden paddle with the alphabet and Lord's Prayer protected by transparent horn, was the first reader. Older children studied the Bible, the New England primer with its rhyming moral lessons. In Adam's false slash we sinned all. Health routines were grimly practical. Baths were rare, once a month if lucky, in a wooden tub hauled indoors and filled bucket by bucket. Teeth were cleaned with salt or soot on a rag. Toothaches were endured or treated with oil of cloves if available. Head lice were combed out with fine-toothed combs or shaved in bad cases. When illness struck, families relied on the family physic book, receipts for poultices, teas, syrups. A fever might be treated with a cool vinegar sponge, a cough with horehound candy, or rum toddy. Bleeding was still common. Barbers or self-taught practitioners opened veins with lancets until the patient paled. Childbirth happened at home with a midwife or neighbor women. The mother labored on a low birthing stool or in bed, surrounded by prayers and hot water. Many infants and mothers did not survive the first week. Social texture varied by region, but shared a certain rawness. In the Chesapeake, planters entertained with barbecues, whole hogs roasted over pits, rum punch flowing. Gambling on horse races or cockfights was common. Debts were settled with land or livestock. In New England, social life centered on the meeting house. Lecture days brought sermons on sin. Fast days called for humiliation and prayer. Court days doubled as market days. People came to town for justice and gossip, to buy nails or cloth, to trade news. Taverns served as neutral ground. Flip, beer, rum, sugar, scorched with a hot poker, syllabub, cream whipped with cider, small beer for all ages. Yet even in religious strongholds, human nature asserted itself. Fornication cases filled court records, couples marrying hurriedly after the first child arrived. Drunkenness was fined, but not eradicated. In Quaker Pennsylvania, simplicity was the rule. No bright colors, no ruffles. But even there, merchants quietly accumulated wealth while preaching plainness. Let's linger a little longer on the small, repetitive motions that filled those days. The scrape of a wooden spoon in a pot, the creak of a spinning wheel, the thud of an axe in frozen wood, the soft hiss of a tallow dip being snuffed. These were the sounds that carried people through decades. No trumpets, no fanfare, just the steady turning of seasons and the stubborn will to see the next one. We'll keep going in a moment. Rest your eyes if they're heavy. We've come this far together, haven't we? The hearth fire has burned down to a soft red glow. The wind outside has settled into a low murmur against the clapboards, and the night feels deeper now, heavier with the weight of all those ordinary days we've already walked through. Let's keep drifting, picking up exactly where the last candle sputtered out. In the quiet hours after supper, when families sat close to the remaining warmth and the stories they told each other began to stretch longer than the daylight ever did. In most colonial households, evening was the only time the rhythm slowed. Supper cleared away, wooden trenchers stacked, the last of the stew scraped into a covered pot for tomorrow. The family gathered around the hearth. Father might sharpen an axe or mend a harness by firelight. Mother darned stockings or spun wool on a drop spindle that clicked softly with each twist. Children, if they weren't already nodding off against someone's knee, listened. Stories came then, Old tales brought from England about highwaymen or fairies, newer ones about the woods, panthers that screamed like women, bears that raided cornfields, ghosts of soldiers lost in the last Indian War. The Bible was read aloud most nights, the book of Psalms or Proverbs, the words familiar enough that even the youngest could join in on the refrains. No novels yet. Those were rare and expensive, but almanacs passed from hand to hand, their pages filled with planting advice, weather lore, crude jokes, and moral warnings about idleness. That idleness, of course, was the great colonial sin. Work was virtue, leisure was suspect. Yet people found small ways to steal moments. Men slipped to the tavern after dark when the moon was high enough to see the path. Small, low-ceilinged buildings with sanded floors, a long bar of rough planks, benches along the walls. Flip was the drink of choice. Strong beer, rum, sugar, scorched with a red-hot poker until it foamed. A mug cost a few pence. A round could loosen tongues for hours. Conversation turned to land prices, the latest tax from London, whose cow wandered again, whose daughter was walking out with the wrong boy. Gambling happened quietly. Dice in a corner, cards dealt under the table when the constable wasn't looking. Cockfights drew crowds on Saturdays in the Chesapeake. Men wagered tobacco notes or livestock, cheering as birds toward each other in a cloud of feathers and blood. In New England, the authorities tried harder to stamp it out. Fines, stocks, public whippings, but the impulse never quite died. Women's social world was smaller, more domestic. Quilting bees brought neighbors together once the harvest was in. Frames set up in the biggest room. Women stitching through layers of wool and cotton, while gossip flowed as steadily as the needle. A new baby quilt might be finished in an afternoon. Stories of difficult births, wayward husbands, strange dreams shared in low voices. Spinning frolics were similar, wheels turning in rhythm, laughter rising when someone's thread snapped. These gatherings were practical. Cloth was expensive, homespun cheaper, but they were also the only place women could speak freely without men listening. Courtship happened in the margins of these events. A young man lingered after a husking bee to walk a girl home, or bundling took place in some households. The couple lay in the same bed, fully clothed, separated by a wooden board or heavy quilt. Parents approved it as supervised courtship. Accidents still happened, and shotgun weddings followed. Naturally, the ministers preached against it, but sermons rarely changed human nature. Religion shaped the weak more than any law. In Puritan Massachusetts and Connecticut, Sunday began at dawn. Families walked or rode to the meeting house, often miles, in their best, though still plain clothes. Services lasted all morning. 2 long sermons, psalms sung without instruments, organs were popish, prayers that seemed to go on forever. Afternoon brought catechism for children, more preaching, perhaps a lecture on a saint's day or fast day. No cooking, no play, cold suppers prepared Saturday. Missing service without good reason meant fines or the stocks. Yet even the godly found ways around the rules. Young people slipped out after dark for frolics, dancing, kissing games, cider, then crept home before parents woke. Diaries from the time are full of confessions, fell into vain mirth, wasted time in idle discourse. The guilt was real, but so was the need for release. In the middle colonies, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, the religious landscape was patchwork. Quakers in Philadelphia met in plain brick meeting houses, sat in silence until someone felt moved to speak. No ministers, no liturgy. Equality was the rule. Women spoke as freely as men. Slaves sometimes sat beside masters. Yet even Quakers had their tensions. Schisms over slavery, dress, oaths. German sects, Lutherans, Mennonites, Moravians, brought their own customs. Moravians in Bethlehem lived communally, slept in single-sex choirs, groups, decided marriages by lot. If the lot paired you with someone plain or grumpy, you accepted it as God's will. Ironic how divine guidance could feel so much like chance. The southern colonies leaned Anglican, though practice was looser. Church was social as much as spiritual. Families arrived in carriages or on horseback, greeted neighbors in the churchyard, lingered after service to trade news. Sermons were shorter, less fire and brimstone. Planters' families sat in private pews near the front. Servants and enslaved people stood at the back or in galleries. Enslaved attendance was uneven. Some masters encouraged it, better control. Others forbade it, fear of organized revolt. In the quarters, spiritual life happened after dark. Songs that carried African rhythms, prayers whispered in cabins, secret meetings in the woods. The spirituals that later became famous had roots here. Codes and lyrics, hope wrapped in sorrow. Law and punishment were public theater. Court day in a county seat drew crowds. Litigants, witnesses, spectators. Magistrates, usually local planters or merchants, sat behind a table, heard cases about stray hogs, broken fences, slander, assault. Punishments were meant to shame as much as hurt. Thieves stood in the pillory, ears nailed to the board for an hour. Scolds, usually women, were ducked in a pond on a wooden chair. Fornicators wore scarlet letters or were whipped at the post. Adulterers faced the same, plus divorce was almost impossible. In Virginia, runaway servants had time added to their indenture. Days for each day absent, plus brands or cropped ears for repeat offenders. Enslaved people had no legal protection. A master could whip, brand, maim, even kill with little consequence. Yet resistance happened. Tools lost, crops trampled at night. Slow work that looked like clumsiness. Small acts, but constant. Education was patchy and class-bound. In New England, towns were required to maintain schools after a certain number of households. Usually a dame school, run by a widow or spinster in her front room. Children learned letters from a hornbook, then reading from the New England Primer, sums on slates, scripture by heart. Boys continued longer if the family could spare them. Girls rarely passed basic literacy. In the South, education was private. Tutors for planter children, often Scots or Englishmen who taught Latin, Greek, mathematics, dancing. Girls learned needlework, music, deportment. Poor children learned nothing formal. Apprenticeships taught trades instead. Books were scarce and precious. Family Bibles, almanacs, a few sermons, or conduct manuals. Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac was the closest thing to popular reading. Proverbs, weather forecasts, jokes, advice on thrift and industry. Early to bed and early to rise. He wrote, knowing full well most colonists rose before dawn whether they wanted to or not. Hygiene and health routines remained rudimentary. Bathing was seasonal, once or twice a summer in a creek or tub. Hair was washed with lye soap or egg yolk, then combed with bone combs that caught lice. Teeth were scrubbed with salt, soot, or chalk. Toothpicks were twigs. Chamber pots stood under beds, emptied into the yard or street each morning. Cities like Boston and Philadelphia stank in summer. Open sewers, dead animals, night soil carted away, or not. Flies swarmed. Mosquitoes carried fevers no one yet connected to them. Smallpox was the great terror. Inoculation, scratching pus from an active sore into the arm, was risky but saved lives for those brave enough. Yellow fever arrived in ships from the Caribbean. Victims turned jaundiced, bled from nose and gums, died in days. Quarantine flags flew. Bonfires burned to purify the air. Yet amid the hardship, small joys persisted. Apple butter boilings in autumn. Huge kettles over open fires. Neighbors stirring for hours. Children sneaking tastes. Corn shuckings. Husk stripped from ears. Red ears earning kisses. Fairs in larger towns. Races, wrestling, pie-eating contests. Music drifted from taverns, fiddles, fifes, sometimes a banjo brought by enslaved musicians. Dances happened in barns or parlors. Reels, jigs, minuets for the gentry. Courtship flourished in these moments. A glance across the floor, a stolen walk under the moon. Elites lived parallel lives. Their houses had multiple rooms, parlors with turkey carpets, dining rooms with silver plate, bedrooms with four-posters and feather beds. They imported tea, chocolate, silk, books. William Byrd, too, of Westover, kept a diary and code, recording his meals, his reading, his sexual encounters, often with enslaved women, his bowel movements. Fastidious, vain, he weighed himself daily and noted every ounce. Thomas Jefferson at Monticello designed gadgets, revolving book stands, dumbwaiters, while enslaved people built the mansion brick by brick. His debts mounted. He died owing more than his estate was worth. Ironic for a man who wrote so eloquently about liberty. Let the small details settle now. The scratch of a quill on paper, the creak of a cradle, the low hum of a psalm carried on the night air. Colonial society was neither noble nor monstrous. It was human, flawed, persistent. We'll drift on a little further soon. The fire has settled now into a low bed of embers, just enough glow to outline the shapes in the room without throwing sharp shadows. The night outside feels vast and still, the way colonial nights often did when the last candle was snuffed and the only sounds left were the creak of the house settling, the distant bark of a dog, or the soft hoot of an owl somewhere in the dark woods. We've walked through so many of those days already. The mud underfoot in Jamestown, the cold fingers of a New England winter, the endless green rows of tobacco that both saved and trapped whole generations. Let's stay right here in this quiet hour and let the story ease to its close, not with any grand flourish, but with the same patient rhythm that carried people through decade after decade. No hurry, just the slow turning of seasons, the small accumulations of habit and hope, and the way ordinary lives quietly shaped something much larger than themselves. By the middle of the 18th century, the colonies had grown from a handful of struggling outposts into a string of settled societies stretching from the rocky coast of Maine to the low rice fields of Carolina. Population swelled, not just for natural increase, but from wave after wave of newcomers. Scots-Irish poured into the backcountry of Pennsylvania and Virginia. Hardy people used to rough hills and clan feuds, bringing with them a suspicion of authority and a taste for whiskey distilled in hidden stills. Germans, called Pennsylvania Dutch, though most came from the Palatinate, settled the fertile valleys, building sturdy barns with hex signs painted on the sides, planting neat rows of cabbage and turnips, speaking their own language in church and market. The Scots Highlanders arrived after Culloden, some as indentured servants, others as soldiers granted land. They kept their bagpipes and plaids for a generation or two before the forest swallowed the old ways. And always the enslaved population grew, by birth and by the brutal arithmetic of the Atlantic trade. In Virginia and Maryland, they outnumbered free whites in many counties. In South Carolina, they were the majority. Their labor built the wealth that let a few families live in brick houses with white fences and imported wallpaper. Daily life in these later years had softened at the edges for some, hardened for others. In a prosperous Virginia household, say, one of the great river plantations like Carter's Grove or Berkeley, the day began with the ringing of a bell or the crack of an overseer's whip. Enslaved people rose first, long before the family in the big house stirred. They lit fires in the kitchen dependency, hauled water from the well, milked cows, fed hogs, swept yards, carried firewood. Breakfast for the quarters was simple. Ash cakes baked on a hoe blade over coals, perhaps a bit of molasses or fatback if the week had been good. The planter's family ate later in the dining room. Ham, eggs from their own hens, wheat bread, a luxury. coffee imported through Norfolk or Yorktown. Silver spoons clinked against porcelain cups. Conversation turned to London fashions, the latest horse race at Williamsburg, or the price tobacco might fetch next season. The planter himself. Let's imagine someone like Robert King Carter's grandson, inheritor of tens of thousands of acres, spent mornings riding the fields on a good horse, inspecting work, noting which overseer needed replacing. Afternoons might find him in the study, cool scratching across ledgers, debts to London merchants, shipments of hogsheads, lists of enslaved people with ages, skills, values. He was literate, educated at William and Mary or in England, dressed in silk waistcoats and powdered wigs, even on ordinary days. Yet his world was small, neighbors miles apart, news arriving weeks late by post rider or ship. Petty quarrels loomed large, boundary lines disputed for decades, water rights fought over in court, marriages arranged to consolidate land rather than affection. His wife managed the household with military precision. Keys to the storeroom on a chatelaine at her waist, inventories of linens and plate kept in a locked desk. She oversaw spinning, preserving, the still room where cordials and medicines were distilled. Their children, tutored at home by Scotsmen or clergymen, learned Latin, French, dancing, fencing for the boys, embroidery, harpsichord, deportment for the girls. When company came, tables groaned with roasted turkey, Virginia ham, oysters, syllabub, Madeira. Conversation flowed. Politics crept in more often now, grumbling about the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townsend duties. But life continued. The fields still needed tending. The ledgers still needed balancing. In the quarters the day ended differently. After field work, sunup to sundown, with only the briefest noon rest, enslaved people returned to cabins of log or frame, dirt floors, stick and clay chimneys. Supper was cooked communally sometimes, a pot of greens and cornmeal, salt fish, perhaps a stolen chicken if the risk seemed worth it. Nights brought the only privacy they had. Stories were told in low voices, Anansi tales from West Africa mixed with new ones born here, songs that carried coded messages of escape or endurance. Religion happened in secret meetings deep in the woods or in hushed prayers after dark. The spirituals grew richer. Swing low, sweet chariot, wade in the water, layers of meaning hidden from white ears. Resistance took quiet forms, feigned illness, broken tools, crops planted wrong on purpose. Runaways were common enough that newspapers carried descriptions. Negro man, about 30, scar on left cheek, answers to Pompey, and rewards offered. Most were caught. Some made it to the Dismal Swamp or to Spanish Florida. Families were fragile. Sales tore parents from children, husbands from wives. But kinship networks persisted, names passed down, stories remembered. In northern towns, the texture was different, busier. Boston by 1760 had paved streets, some of them, brick houses 3 stories tall, shops with bow windows displaying imported goods, tea from China, calico from India, hardware for Birmingham. Markets rang with cries of vendors selling fish, vegetables, firewood. Artisans worked in small shops, cobblers hammering saws, silversmiths engraving tankards, printers setting type for gazettes full of advertisements and political essays. Taverns were everywhere. The Green Dragon, the Bunch of Grapes, the Salutation. Men gathered there after work, shipwrights, rope makers, merchants' clerks, drinking rum punch or small beer, reading aloud from the latest London papers or Sam Adams' latest broadside. Women kept shops too, milliners, mantua makers, grocers, balancing account books while minding children. Street life was noisy. Hawkers, cartwheels on cobblestones, church bells, the occasional brawl outside a tavern. Education had spread. In New England, most towns had grammar schools. Literacy rates approached 70% among men, 40 among women, high for the time. Harvard, Yale, Princeton trained ministers and lawyers. In Philadelphia, Franklin's Academy, later the University of Pennsylvania, offered practical subjects, surveying, bookkeeping, modern languages, alongside classics. Books circulated more widely. Circulating libraries, almanacs, pamphlets. The Enlightenment arrived in fragments. Locke, Montesquieu, Newton discussed in coffee houses and parlors. Yet superstition lingered. Almanacs still printed astrological predictions. People avoided Friday the 13th, carried rabbit's feet, or wore bags of asafoetida against disease. Health practices evolved slowly. Inoculation against smallpox became more accepted after the 1721 Boston epidemic. By the 1750s, it was routine in cities. Doctors, often self-taught or apprenticed, used calomel, mercury chloride, for everything, bleeding patients until they fainted, blistering skin with Cantharides beetles. Midwifery remained women's domain. Martha Ballard in Maine delivered hundreds of babies, set bones, treated fevers with herbal teas, all recorded in her meticulous diary. Yellow fever still arrived on ships. 1793 Philadelphia saw thousands die, bodies carted away at night, fear emptying the streets. As the 1760s turned into the 1770s, the air changed. Taxes from Parliament, Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Townshend Acts landed like steady drips on stone. Merchants grumbled, artisans rioted, newspapers printed fiery essays. Sons of Liberty organized, tarred and feathered customs officers, burned stamped paper. Yet daily life persisted. Farmers still plowed, women still spun, children still carried water. In Virginia, the gentry met at Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg, drank toast to liberty, while their enslaved people served the punch. In Boston, the same men who signed non-importation agreements still imported tea quietly when they thought no one was watching. Hypocrisy was as colonial as cornmeal. The revolution would come, of course, muskets at Lexington, declarations in Philadelphia, years of war. But that is another story, one that began in these very days of ordinary labor and ordinary complaints. The cabins, the quarters, the meeting houses, the taverns, the fields, they were the foundation. People did not think of themselves as building a nation. They thought of getting through winter, paying the parson's rate, keeping the cow from the neighbor's corn. Yet here, in the slow accumulation of small choices, whether to obey the latest tax, whether to shelter a runaway, whether to speak out at town meeting, the larger shape began to form. So let us leave them there, in the quiet of an ordinary evening. A mother tucks a child into a straw tick, humming a psalm. A man banks the fire for the night. A woman folds the day's mending and sets it aside. Outside, the stars are sharp above the dark trees, the same stars our grandparents saw when they first stepped ashore. The colonies were never perfect. Mud, mosquitoes, injustice, hardship. But they were stubborn. They endured. They changed, inch by inch, generation by generation. The embers are almost gone now. The room is cooling. Let the night take the rest. Sleep well, Cameron. The past is still there when you wake.